The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Silver Creek Ranch just as the sun bled crimson across the Wyoming horizon. Eleanor Hayes stepped down onto the dusty earth, her worn boots meeting ground that felt as uncertain as her future. She clutched a single carpetbag. Everything she owned in this world compressed into faded fabric and desperate hope. The advertisement had been clear: housekeeper wanted. Remote ranch. Cooking and cleaning. Wages fair. Inquire Silver Creek, Wyoming territory. Nothing about the advertisement mentioned the tall, weathered cowboy who now stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking at her with eyes that held more storms than the Montana sky. Nothing mentioned the small boy half hidden behind his father's leg, thin as a willow switch, with eyes too old for his 7 years. Miss Hayes. The cowboy's voice was rough and used to conversation. Mr. Thornton? Eleanor's own voice surprised her, steadier than she felt. He nodded once, sharp and certain. But it was the boy who made her breath catch. He stepped forward, those ancient eyes studying her face like he was searching for something he'd lost long ago. His small hand reached out, fingers dirty from a day's work no child should know, and touched the edge of her travel-worn sleeve. "Are you her?" the boy whispered, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Something she thought had died back in Boston when the bank took her father's house, when the charitable society ladies looked at her with pity and judgment in equal measure. "Am I who, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling down despite the dust that would stain her only good dress. The boy looked at his father, then back to Eleanor. "Are you the one who'll stay?" And in that moment, Eleanor Hayes realized she hadn't come west just to cook meals and sweep floors. She'd come to find out if she had anything left worth giving. The inside of the Silver Creek Ranch house told Eleanor everything the advertisement hadn't. This wasn't just a home needing a housekeeper. It was a monument to absence, a shrine to someone who'd left and taken all the warmth with her. Thomas Thornton carried her bag across the threshold without ceremony, his boots echoing on floorboards that hadn't known polish in months, maybe years. The boy, Samuel, she'd learned during the brief introductions, darted ahead, small feet whisper quiet compared to his father's heavy tread. "Kitchen's through there," Thomas said, gesturing to a doorway where late sunlight struggled through unwashed windows. "Your room's upstairs, first door on the right. We take breakfast at dawn, supper at sunset. Samuel eats whatever you put in front of him without complaint." Eleanor set down her bag and really looked at the place. The furniture was good solid oak pieces built by hands that knew their craft, but everything wore a layer of neglect like mourning clothes. Dishes were stacked in the dry sink, crusty with days-old food. The windows hadn't seen a rag in so long the glass looked frosted. Children's drawings were tacked to one wall, their edges curling, the colors faded where sun had touched them day after day. But it was the piano in the corner that stopped her heart. A beautiful upright, probably hauled over mountains at considerable expense, now silent beneath a shroud of dust. Sheet music sat open on the stand. Someone had been playing Beautiful Dreamer and never finished. "My wife's," Thomas said, following her gaze. His voice had gone flat, carefully empty. "She came from Philadelphia. Thought a piano would make this place feel like home." "Did it?" The question escaped before Eleanor could cage it. Thomas looked at the instrument for a long moment. For a while. Then he turned away, shoulders rigid. "Samuel will show you around tomorrow. I've got horses to check before dark." He was gone before Eleanor could respond, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty rooms. Samuel remained, standing near the kitchen doorway, watching her with that unsettling intensity. "Papa doesn't talk about Mama," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "Not since the fever took her. That was 412 days ago." Eleanor's throat tightened. 412 days. The boy had counted every single one. "That must be very hard," she said softly, moving toward the kitchen. Better to do something with her hands than stand uselessly in grief-soaked silence. The kitchen was worse than the parlor. Every surface needed scrubbing. The stove was cold, its belly full of old ash. She found the makings of a meal: potatoes in a bin, some questionable bacon in the cold cellar, flour in a tin that thankfully was sealed against mice. It wasn't much, but Eleanor had learned to make do with less. Samuel followed her like a shadow as she worked, neither helping nor hindering, just watching. She pumped water into a pot, at least the well was good, and got a fire going in the stove. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. This she understood. This she could do. "What did you eat last night?" she asked, scrubbing potatoes. "Beans from a can." Papa opened it with his knife. "And the night before?" "Beans from a can." Eleanor glanced at the boy. He wasn't complaining, just stating facts. "And before that?" "Beans from a can." A pause. "Sometimes we have bread from town, but it gets hard." "Well," Eleanor said, stoking the fire with more force than necessary, "I don't know much about Wyoming, and I don't know much about ranching, but I know about making a meal that doesn't come from a can." She saw it then, the smallest flicker of something on Samuel's face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening around his eyes, a possibility of hope. They ate together at the scarred kitchen table as darkness pressed against the windows. Eleanor, Samuel, and Thomas, who'd returned without a word and sat down like a man fulfilling an obligation. The meal was simple. Fried potatoes with bacon, biscuits that turned out better than Eleanor expected, coffee for the adults and milk for Samuel. No one spoke. The silence was thick enough to choke on. But Samuel ate 3 helpings of potatoes, and Thomas cleaned his plate. And when Eleanor rose to clear the dishes, she caught Thomas looking at his son's face with an expression that might have been surprise. After Samuel went to bed, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, washing dishes in water she'd heated on the stove. Outside, she could hear cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through grass, the massive silence of the frontier that was nothing like Boston's crowded streets. She'd accepted this position because she was desperate, because a woman alone with no family and no prospects had few choices. But standing in that kitchen, hands deep in warm dishwater, Eleanor realized something that both frightened and exhilarated her. She hadn't come here to be saved. She'd come here to save something else. Morning came to Silver Creek Ranch with the aggressive enthusiasm of a rooster that didn't know when to quit. Eleanor woke disoriented, her body still expecting the cramped boarding house room in Boston, the sounds of street vendors and carriage wheels. Instead, she got wide-open sky visible through thin curtains and a silence so complete it felt like pressure against her eardrums. She dressed quickly in the dawn chill and made her way downstairs, determined to have breakfast ready before Thomas and Samuel woke. But when she reached the kitchen, Thomas was already there, standing at the stove with his back to her, attempting something that might charitably be called coffee. "I can do that," Eleanor said. Thomas, startled, actually flinched and turned. In the early light, she saw him properly for the first time. He couldn't be more than 32, 33, but he wore his years like a much older man. His face was tanned and weathered, with lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. But it was the exhaustion that struck her most, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been running on empty for too long. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. "I'm usually up before dawn." "So am I now," Eleanor replied, moving to take over the coffee. "That's what you're paying me for, isn't it?" Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation, but he shuttered it quickly. "I suppose it is." He grabbed his hat from a peg by the door. "Samuel will be down soon. He has chores before breakfast, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens. He knows what to do." "What time do you want breakfast?" "Whenever it's ready." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Miss Hayes, I should tell you, the last 3 housekeepers didn't last more than 2 weeks. Place is too remote for most women. Too quiet. If you're having second thoughts, I'll pay your return fare to Laramie." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "Are you trying to get rid of me already, Mr. Thornton? Just giving you an out before you're in too deep." "I don't need an out. I need employment and you need help." That seems straightforward enough. He studied her for a long moment, like he was trying to see through to whatever truth she was hiding. Finally, he nodded once and left, letting the door close softly behind him. Samuel appeared as promised. carrying a basket of eggs with the careful concentration of someone handling precious cargo. He set them on the counter without a word, then stood there, waiting. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "Morning." The boy's voice was quiet, testing. "How do you like your eggs?" Samuel blinked, confusion crossing his face. "However they come." Eleanor crouched down to his level. "That's not what I asked. I asked how you like them. Fried? Scrambled? Boiled?" The boy looked genuinely bewildered, like she'd asked him to solve a mathematics problem far beyond his years. I don't know." "Then we'll have to find out, won't we?" Eleanor smiled. "This morning scrambled. Tomorrow fried. Next day boiled. We'll work our way through until you have an opinion. Papa says opinions don't matter much when you're just trying to survive." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. This child, 7 years old and already believing his preferences didn't matter, that wanting things was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Your papa is wrong about that," Eleanor said firmly. "Surviving isn't the same as living, Samuel. And everyone deserves to know how they like their eggs." She saw Thomas through the window, heading toward the barn, shoulders set against the morning chill. This family wasn't just grieving, they were disappearing, erasing themselves bit by bit, reducing life to its barest essentials because anything more felt like betrayal or invited too much pain. The days fell into a pattern. Eleanor rose before dawn, made breakfast, packed a lunch for Thomas, who spent daylight hours mending fences or working with the horses or doing the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. She cleaned the house room by room, fighting back years of accumulated neglect. She cooked meals that Thomas ate in silence and Samuel consumed with quiet wonder. But it was the unspoken rules that governed the household that told the real story. Don't ask about the past. Don't mention Mrs. Thornton. Don't touch the piano. Don't expect conversation. Don't look for warmth. Don't settle in too comfortably because nothing here is permanent. Eleanor watched Thomas and Samuel move around each other like planets in separate orbits. Close but never touching, pulled by gravity but maintaining careful distance. The boy loved his father. That was obvious in how his eyes followed Thomas whenever he was near, and Thomas loved his son. She saw it in the way he checked that Samuel had eaten enough, that his jacket was buttoned against the wind. But love trapped behind walls of silence and grief wasn't enough to sustain anyone. 3 weeks in, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't fix what was broken here. That wasn't her place, wasn't her right. But she could start opening windows, letting light into dark corners, making space for something besides survival. She started with breakfast, asking Samuel every morning how he'd slept. She hummed while she worked. She opened curtains. She put wildflowers in a jar on the table. Small rebellions against the tyranny of grief. The storm came on a Tuesday, rolling across the prairie with the inevitability of judgment. Eleanor had seen the clouds building all morning, massive thunderheads piling up against the western sky like dark fortresses. By noon, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain and electricity. Thomas came in earlier than usual, his face tight with concern. "Storm's going to be bad," he said, securing the windows with practiced efficiency. "Samuel, make sure the chickens are locked up tight. Miss Hayes, we might lose the chimney draft if the wind shifts. Best to let the stove go cold after lunch." They prepared like soldiers before battle, battening down, securing loose items, bringing in extra water. Samuel moved through his tasks with quiet competence, but Eleanor saw the tension in his small shoulders, the way he kept glancing at the darkening sky. The storm hit mid-afternoon with apocalyptic fury. Rain lashed the windows. Wind screamed around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. Thunder cracked so loud it shook the floorboards, and lightning turned the world white for split seconds that left afterimages burned into Eleanor's vision. Samuel stood at the parlor window, watching the storm with wide eyes. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "It's loud," Samuel said. "Not quite afraid but not quite steady either." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "But the house is strong. Your father built it to withstand worse than this." "Mama hated storms," Samuel said suddenly. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised Eleanor. She used to play the piano when they came. Said music was stronger than thunder. Eleanor's heart clenched. She glanced at Thomas, who had gone absolutely still across the room, his face carefully blank. Did she play well? Eleanor asked softly. Samuel nodded. Real pretty. She taught me Twinkle Twinkle. I can only play it with one hand, but she said that was a good start. His voice dropped. We were going to practice the next day, but then she got the fever. The silence that followed was different from the usual oppressive quiet of the house. This silence had weight and shape. It was grief finally given words after more than a year locked away. Thomas stood abruptly and walked out, not grabbing his coat despite the rain, just pushing through the door into the storm. Eleanor watched him go, saw him standing on the porch with rain hammering down, his hands braced on the railing, his head bowed. Did I make him mad? Samuel asked, worry creeping into his voice. No, sweetheart, Eleanor said, pulling the boy close. You didn't make him mad. Sometimes people need to feel the storm on the outside because the one on the inside is too big to handle. They stood together, watching the rain, and Eleanor made another decision. She moved to the piano, pulling off the dusty cloth in one smooth motion. Dust motes swirled in the storm-dimmed light. She sat down on the bench, her fingers finding the keys. I'm not very good, she warned Samuel. I only had 2 years of lessons before my father lost his business. But I remember some. She began to play Beautiful Dreamer, the piece left unfinished on the stand for 412 days. Her fingers stumbled over the notes, finding the melody through muscle memory and determination. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was music, filling the space where only silence had lived. Samuel moved closer, climbing onto the bench beside her. Mama sat like this when she taught me. Eleanor shifted to make room. Show me what she taught you. The boy's small fingers picked out Twinkle Twinkle with one hand, hesitant, uncertain, but true. Eleanor added bass notes with her left hand, supporting his melody. They played together, boy and woman who'd known each other less than a month, making music in a house that had forgotten how. The door opened. Thomas stood there, soaked through, water dripping from his hat. He looked at them, at his son playing the piano his mother had loved, at the stranger who dared to uncover it, at the scene he'd probably feared he'd never see again. Eleanor stopped playing, but Samuel continued, his attention fixed on the keys, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Don't stop, Thomas said hoarsely. Please. So Eleanor played again, and Samuel joined her. And Thomas stood in the doorway listening to imperfect music fill the spaces in their broken home. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something small and fragile unfurled. Not healing exactly, but the beginning of possibility. When the song ended, Samuel looked at his father. Is it okay, Papa, that we played Mama's piano? Thomas crossed the room and knelt before his son, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, he pulled the boy into his arms. Really held him, not just a hand on the shoulder or a brief pat, but a full embrace. It's more than okay, Thomas said into Samuel's hair. Your mama would have loved to hear you play. And just like that, the first wall came down. The morning after the storm dawned crystalline and new, like the world had been washed clean. Eleanor woke to find Thomas already in the kitchen. Not making terrible coffee this time, but sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around a cup, staring at nothing. Couldn't sleep, he said when she appeared. Kept thinking about yesterday, about how long it's been since I heard that piano. Eleanor moved carefully, giving him space while she started breakfast preparations. Samuel plays well for someone so young. Margaret, my wife, she had plans to teach him properly. She came from a musical family. Her father was a conductor in Philadelphia. Thomas's voice was rough with disuse, like machinery starting up after a long silence. I met her when I was back east buying breeding stock. She was at a concert, wearing a blue dress, and when she laughed, I knew I'd do anything to hear that sound every day. It was the most he'd said in one go since Eleanor arrived. She cracked eggs into a bowl, staying quiet, letting him find his words. I told her what life would be like out here, tried to be honest. The isolation, the work, the weather. She said she didn't care. Said love was enough. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. For a while it was. She planted flowers, made curtains, taught Samuel his letters, played that damn piano every evening, made this house feel like more than just a place to sleep between work. And then the fever, Eleanor said softly. And then the fever. Thomas set down his cup with deliberate care. Doc from town came, but by then, he said if we'd been closer to a real hospital, maybe. If she'd been stronger after Samuel's birth. She never quite recovered fully. If the winter hadn't been so hard. So many ifs. He looked up at Eleanor. I couldn't save her. Couldn't protect her from the thing she wanted most. This life with me. Eleanor turned from the stove to face him fully. Mr. Thornton, may I speak plainly? He nodded, wary. Your wife made a choice. She chose you, chose this life, chose the risks along with the rewards. Taking that choice away from her now, by drowning in guilt, doesn't honor her memory. It just makes her sacrifice meaningless. Thomas's jaw worked. For a moment, Eleanor thought she'd overstepped, that he'd shut down or dismiss her. Instead, he said, You don't pull your punches, do you, Miss Hayes? I've found that honesty, while not always comfortable, tends to save time. She turned back to the eggs. Besides, you didn't hire me for my diplomatic skills. You hired me to cook and clean. The unsolicited advice comes free of charge. She heard him huff. Not quite a laugh, but close. Fair enough. Samuel appeared then, and they ate breakfast together. But this morning felt different. Thomas asked Samuel about his plans for the day. Samuel chattered about the new calf in the barn. Small talk, mundane and ordinary, but in this house it felt revolutionary. After breakfast, Thomas surprised her. Miss Hayes, could you ride? I've been on a horse precisely 3 times in my life, and 2 of those times I fell off. Then it's time for a 4th. Can't live on a ranch and not know how to handle a horse. Samuel needs to check the fence line in the south pasture, and I need to ride up to check on the cattle. You should come. See the land. Eleanor wanted to refuse. She had 100 tasks waiting inside. But something in Thomas's expression made her reconsider. This was an invitation, maybe even a peace offering. I'll try not to fall off this time, she said. Thomas saddled a gentle mare named Daisy, giving Eleanor patient instructions on mounting and holding the reins. Samuel sat his pony with the easy grace of someone born to it, grinning at Eleanor's awkwardness. They rode out together, leaving the ranch house behind. The land opened up, vast and rolling, grass still wet from yesterday's rain. The sky impossibly blue. Eleanor clung to the saddle horn with probably more force than necessary, but Daisy plodded along with good-natured patience. This is beautiful, Eleanor said, meaning it. It is, Thomas agreed. Margaret saw that right away. I'd gotten so used to it, I'd stopped seeing. She made me look again. He pointed to a rise in the distance. She's buried there under the cottonwood. High ground with a view. She liked sitting up there in the evenings. Eleanor saw Samuel listening, his young face serious. This was important. Thomas talking about Margaret naturally, not like she was a forbidden subject but like she was still part of their lives, still woven into the landscape. They rode for 2 hours, checking fence lines and cattle, with Thomas explaining the ranch's workings. Samuel chimed in with his own observations, proud of his knowledge. Eleanor listened and learned, feeling the rhythm of this place, beginning to understand what Margaret had seen. Not just beauty, but possibility. Not just isolation, but freedom. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Eleanor's legs were shaking, and she was fairly certain she'd never walk normally again. But she'd also seen something else. The flash of Thomas's rare smile when she successfully guided Daisy around a muddy patch. The sound of Samuel's laughter when a jackrabbit startled them. Small moments, but they mattered. 6 weeks had passed since Eleanor arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, and the house had transformed. Not completely. Ghosts couldn't be scrubbed away with soap and water, but enough. The windows gleamed. The floors shone. The piano was played every evening now, sometimes by Eleanor, increasingly by Samuel, occasionally with Thomas standing nearby, listening. But it was the small intimacies that marked the real changes. Thomas now poured himself coffee and waited for Eleanor to join him before drinking it. Samuel had opinions about everything from eggs, scrambled, definitively, to whether clouds looked more like horses or ships. Horses, obviously. Dinner conversation had evolved beyond necessity into something approaching enjoyment. Eleanor had stopped thinking of her time here as temporary, which was dangerous. She'd learned not to get attached to places or people. Life had taught her that particular lesson with brutal efficiency. Yet here she was, memorizing the way morning light hit the kitchen window, the sound of Thomas's boots on the porch, the weight of Samuel's hand slipping into hers when they walked to gather eggs. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. The rider from town brought mail and supplies once a week, and usually there was nothing for Eleanor. But this time, he handed her an envelope with a Boston postmark, and her stomach dropped. She waited until evening, until Samuel was in bed and Thomas was doing his nightly check of the barn, before opening it. The letter was from Mrs. Carolyn Pritchard of the Ladies' Charitable Society, written in the same precise, judgmental hand that had informed Eleanor her father's debts were not the society's responsibility, that her character references were insufficient, that proper young women didn't find themselves in such situations. Dear Miss Hayes, I write to inform you that your circumstances have changed. Your late father's business partner, Mr. Gerald Stevens, has been located in California. He has expressed willingness to honor the debts he fled, including those owed to your father's estate. A modest sum has been placed in trust for you at Boston Savings Bank. Furthermore, the society has secured you a position as companion to Mrs. Theodore Hartwell, widow of the shipping magnate. Room, board, and appropriate salary provided. Mrs. Hartwell is a woman of impeccable reputation and good standing. You are expected to return to Boston by month's end to assume your new responsibilities. Please inform us of your travel arrangements. With Christian regard, Mrs. Carolyn Pritchard. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, waiting to feel something. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. This was everything she'd hoped for back when she'd fled Boston with nothing but desperation and borrowed train fare. Security. Respectability. A future that didn't involve wondering if she'd have employment from one month to the next. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt hollow. Bad news. Thomas's voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, concern etched on his face. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. Not bad exactly. Complicated. She handed it to him, watching his face as he read. His expression shuddered. Well, congratulations are in order, I suppose. Boston. Proper employment. That's good. Is it? Thomas handed the letter back, not meeting her eyes. Of course it is. This place. Miss Hayes, you've done more in 6 weeks than I dared hope. The house is livable again. Samuel smiles. I can. He paused, jaw working. I can breathe easier. But this was always temporary, wasn't it? You're educated, refined. You belong in a city, not breaking your back on a hardscrabble ranch. You don't get to decide where I belong, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the heat in her voice. I'm trying to do the right thing here. By pushing me away? By not being selfish. Thomas's voice rose. You have a chance at a real life, Eleanor. Security. Society. A future that doesn't involve wondering if the cattle prices will hold or if the winter will be hard enough to break us. I can't ask you to give that up. You're not asking. I'm choosing. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning they hadn't yet acknowledged. Thomas stared at her, and Eleanor saw the war in his expression. Want and duty, hope and fear, the desperate need to reach for something good fighting against the bone-deep terror of losing it. Samuel asked me something yesterday, Thomas said finally, his voice rough. He asked if you were going to stay forever like a real mother. I told him you were our housekeeper, that you had your own life. He looked at me like I'd struck him. What do you want, Thomas? Eleanor asked quietly, using his first name deliberately, breaking down another wall. That's not fair. Yes, it is. What do you want? He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the scar above his eyebrow, the vulnerability he kept locked down tight. I want you to stay, he said, the words torn from somewhere deep. Not as a housekeeper, not as an obligation. I want— He stopped, fighting for control. God help me, Eleanor. I want things I have no right to want. But I won't trap you here out of some misguided notion of what you owe us. You deserve better than settling. And what if this isn't settling? Eleanor asked. What if this is choosing? Before Thomas could answer, a small voice came from the stairs. Miss Eleanor? They stepped apart guiltily. Samuel stood there in his nightshirt, rubbing his eyes. I had a bad dream. Will you stay? The question, so simple, so devastating, hung in the air. Eleanor looked at the boy, at the man, at the life she'd stumbled into and somehow made her own. Yes, she said softly. I'll stay. The next morning, Eleanor drafted her response to Mrs. Pritchard before doubt could creep in. The letter was brief and polite, thanking the society for their efforts but declining both the trust fund and the position with Mrs. Hartwell. She didn't explain her reasons. She owed them nothing but courtesy. Thomas found her at the desk in the parlor, sealing the envelope. You're sure? I'm sure. Eleanor. He stopped, struggling with words. I need to be honest with you. This life is hard. Some years the cattle prices hold and we do well. Other years we barely scrape by. Samuel will need schooling, and the nearest proper school is 30 miles away. Winters are brutal. You'll be isolated for months at a time. And he paused, vulnerability raw on his face. I'm not an easy man. I'm set in my ways. I'm not good with words. And I carry more ghosts than any woman should have to live with. Eleanor stood, crossing to where he stood rigid near the doorway. Are you trying to talk me out of staying? I'm trying to make sure you know what you're choosing. I know exactly what I'm choosing. She met his eyes steadily. I'm choosing a life where I matter, where my work has purpose beyond maintaining appearances, where a little boy counts on me and trusts me and asks me about cloud shapes, where a man looks at me like I'm not a problem to be solved but a person worth knowing. She took a breath. I'm choosing a home, Thomas. I'm choosing a family. I'm choosing you. The words hung between them, honest and unadorned. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and when she didn't, he cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. I loved Margaret, he said quietly. I'll always love her. She's part of who I am. I know. I wouldn't want you to stop. But I'm starting to feel things I thought died with her. When I see you with Samuel, teaching him piano, making him laugh. When I come in from the cold and smell supper cooking. When I look up and you're there, solid and real and here. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. I don't have pretty words, Eleanor. But if you stay, I'll spend every day trying to be worth the choice you made. Eleanor's eyes burned. That's more than pretty words. That's everything. He kissed her then, tentative and careful, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. Eleanor kissed him back, tasting coffee and hope and the promise of things she'd stopped letting herself want. When they finally pulled apart, Samuel was standing in the doorway, grinning so wide his face might split. Does this mean Miss Eleanor is staying forever? He asked. Thomas looked at Eleanor, question in his eyes. She nodded. Yes, Thomas said, pulling his son close. If she'll have us. The weeks that followed were a lesson in redefining family. There was no grand wedding, just a simple ceremony in town with the minister, the general store owner and his wife as witnesses, and Samuel holding a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself. Eleanor wore her best dress. Thomas wore a new shirt, and when they exchanged vows, Samuel stood between them, small hands clasped around theirs. Life at Silver Creek Ranch continued its rhythms. Cattle and chickens, fences and weather, the endless work that defined frontier existence. But now there was laughter at mealtimes, music in the evenings, conversations that stretched long into the night after Samuel went to bed. Thomas taught Eleanor to ride properly, to read weather signs, to understand the land they lived on. Eleanor taught Samuel his letters and numbers, helped him become truly proficient at piano, showed him that learning could be joy rather than drudgery. And slowly, carefully, they learned to be a family, not erasing what came before, but building something new alongside the memories. One evening, 6 months after Eleanor's arrival, she stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Eleanor leaned back against him, solid and warm and home. "Not a single one." Inside, Samuel practiced his piano, the notes of Beautiful Dreamer floating through the open window, no longer hesitant but confident, filled with life. The song Margaret had started, Samuel was finishing, and Eleanor had helped make possible. "She'd be glad," Thomas said, reading her thoughts. "Margaret, she'd be glad he has you, that we have you." Eleanor turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm the one who should be glad. You gave me something I thought I'd lost." "What's that?" "A place to belong." They stood together as darkness crept across the prairie, as stars began to prick the deepening sky, as lamplight glowed warm from the windows of the house they'd made home. Some journeys end where they begin, with a question and a choice. Eleanor had come to Silver Creek expecting to cook and clean and collect wages. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found herself, reflected in the eyes of a man learning to live again and a boy learning to love again. Years later, when Samuel was grown with children of his own, he would still remember that evening his father asked Eleanor Hayes the question that changed everything. "What do you want?" He remembered because it was the first time he'd seen his father be truly brave. Not the everyday courage of facing harsh weather or difficult work, but the terrifying vulnerability of opening your heart after loss. He remembered because Eleanor didn't flinch from the question. She stood her ground and chose them, not out of obligation or lack of options, but because she recognized something true and worth fighting for. The Silver Creek Ranch prospered over the years. Thomas and Eleanor had 2 more children, a daughter they named Margaret and a son they called James. Samuel grew into a fine rancher himself, taking over operations when Thomas's joints grew stiff with age. The piano was never silent. All the children learned to play, and visiting grandchildren eventually made their own stumbling attempts at Twinkle Twinkle. But the story people told, the one that became family legend, was about the woman who came west expecting to cook meals and found a home instead. About the grieving widower who learned that loving again wasn't betraying the past. About the boy who counted days of loneliness until the day he asked, "Will you stay?" and received the answer that changed everything. Because some stories aren't about grand adventures or dramatic rescues. Some stories are about quiet courage, about choosing love over safety, about building something beautiful from broken pieces. And sometimes, the greatest adventure is simply learning where you belong.